your previous work, looking at these disparities when it came to, I guess, representation within the education system. Now, the first question that we'd like to ask you about this is, do you believe that the education system within England is making progress in regard to race equality? And now the reason why I'm asking this is because it nicely leads on to our section Mic Check, which is where we put some interesting facts and figures and statistics about different topics. And for today's one, we've got one from the government, and it was looking at essentially some of the research that you've previously mentioned, of looking about how the disparities between students that go to university. It said an interesting statement here that a lot of BAME students, so Black, Asian and minority ethnic students, go to university, but they actually don't see as much success as their white British counterparts. So essentially, we wanted to ask you, do you believe that work is actually being done to address this? Is this improving, or is there a need for greater work to be done?
Well, I'll speak about the secondary education, I suppose pre-university education, because that was the research which I mentioned I've done at UCL. And, you probably know that in the report that I published with my colleagues at UCL, we actually questioned this idea that the education system is making progress in terms of race equality, specifically for minority ethnic teachers. So there is overall diversity gap, and you'll probably cite that later in your facts and figures, but just to give your listeners a flavor. So we have currently 85% of teachers from white British background, but only 65% of students. So there is a 20 percentage point gap between minority ethnic students and teachers. But even when you look at senior leadership teams within schools, the ethnic minority representation is even worse than that. There is some evidence that minority ethnic teachers tend to work in urban and quite diverse schools. And this is not just in England, but in other countries. So in our research, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So you could say, well, so that's good. They're in the right places, for all the good reasons. But there is also evidence that the retention is lower among minority ethnic teachers compared to majority ethnic teachers. So we asked teachers in our research from Black and Asian backgrounds why, for example, they might choose to work in diverse schools and why they might leave those schools. And it was all mainly linked to racial inequalities. So I'll just give you a few examples here. So we did find in interviews that the demographic characteristics of schools are quite important for minority ethnic teachers, and they did choose to go to work in diverse schools. They kind of described very unique, satisfying relationship with minority ethnic students in those schools. But what was quite clear is that diversity of student population alone is not enough to keep those teachers in schools in the long term. It seemed to us that staff diversity was even more important for minority ethnic teachers. So I'll give you an example. So one teacher in our study said that she moved to London because she wanted to teach specifically in a diverse school. And she herself was from Black Caribbean background. But when she moved to her primary school in London, where she said over 90% of children were Black, she very quickly noticed that all 6 members of the senior leadership team were white and also quite young. And that was kind of the last straw for her. And she was at that point leaving teaching after 5 years of qualifying because she felt that the power imbalance created tensions in schools and also demonstrated kind of lack of opportunities for her to progress in her career. So I would call this situation, which seems to be quite common in schools, sort of environmental racial microaggressions, when people don't see other people of their race or ethnicity in senior roles. So that seemed to be the big issue for teachers. But we also found that middle leadership roles within schools, sort of like head of year or head of department, were attainable for minority ethnic teachers. But they described barriers to progression into senior leadership roles. And they also talked about lack of transparency in terms of who progresses or who has opportunities for professional development to be able to progress. And these concerns are very valid because of the national statistics, right? So we know that less than 10% of school leaders across English schools are from non-majority backgrounds. So interestingly also, workload, which is a big issue nationally for teacher retention, was not so much at the forefront of minority ethnic teachers' minds when we talked about retention. So of course they said that workload was high, especially because those teachers we interviewed worked in urban schools with more disadvantaged pupils, where they might have more demand on their time and so on. But most teachers said that it's not the workload which drives minority ethnic teachers out of profession, but lack of opportunities, because workload is actually the same for all teachers. So we even spoke in our report about hidden workload, where on top of normal workload, teachers from minority ethnic groups have to deal with racial microaggression, which are very psychologically exhausting, even for those teachers who are trying to avoid any confrontations. And I think what's interesting is that because we didn't specifically focus on one ethnic group, such as, for example, Black teachers or Asian teachers, we were able to highlight some differences within that sort of broad category of minority or BAME teachers, if you like. So, for example, it's what's interesting that while for some Asian ethnic groups, being from, say, a working class background and lacking that cultural capital was an issue in progression, Black teachers, Black British teachers, who were middle class themselves, said that advantages of their class were not there at all. So, and Black teachers who had migrated to England and, say, had an accent or other disadvantages, faced even more challenges. Interestingly, the mixed race teachers highlighted the issue of colorism and how having light skin improved their chances of getting promotions because they were perceived somehow as less threatening and so on. So subject identities were also quite frequently talked about. So it seemed that experiences are different for, say, a male science teacher who is a teacher of a shortage subject versus, say, a Black primary school teacher, or early years teachers. So there would be those problems. So very similar issues, really, that we read about 20 years ago still are getting described by teachers today, and not just in England. Research from other Anglophone countries, for example, highlight all the same issues. So therefore, that's the answer to your question. Has there been a big progress, or has the education system made progress? Probably not as big as we need to see.